Hey everybody. So this is actually really exciting. I'm really happy to see how many people are here. Before we get started, before I bring Nate up here, there's just a couple of things I wanted to say really quickly. Some people that I want to thank who made this whole thing possible. First of all, I want to give big thanks to the Pulaski Technical College, Oppenheimer Library, and the Division of Fine Arts and Humanities, who have sponsored this event and helped to bring Nate here. It wouldn't be possible without them. I also want to thank the Arkansas Literary Festival. They were able to help get the word out to the community. They've got people out front, volunteers who are taking care of the book sales and the book signing side of this, so they are definitely indispensable parts of this as well. I also want to give a big thanks to every one of you who have come here today, especially to the teachers who have taken time out of their busy schedules to bring their classes here. I know we're coming up near the end of the semester, things get a little bit crazy, so I definitely appreciate it. Finally, and of course last but not least, I want to thank Nate, who, as he's mentioned already, is in the middle of several projects, and he's taken some time out of his schedule to come here and share with us. And just for those of you who are not familiar with Nate already, he's a Little Rock native, and he wears many hats. He's an author and artist who has already made a big splash in the independent and now in the kind of big business industrial side of comics and graphic novels. He's a musician who's performed in a great number of bands, including local punk legend Sufi Nun Squad. He's also the manager of his own record label. He advocates for adults with developmental disabilities, and of course, most recently now, he's also a family man. So his graphic novel, Swallow Me Whole, was just recently. I mean, it's won him several awards already. The Eisner and the Ignatz Awards, most notably. He was also a finalist for the LA Times Book Awards. And to his credit, along with that, he's got a whole library of self-published works and other works on various public publishers, and he'll talk some more about that, I'm sure. But without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring the man up. So, Nate Powell, everybody.
Hey everybody, thanks for everybody coming out. Here's how we're going to do this. Basically, I'll give you a quick overview of, I guess, my life and my path through making comics and doing narratives. We've got a slideshow, sort of move us through that. And pretty much then, you know, people are here for a variety of reasons, so we can open it up to questions. You know, basically, comics and working comics involves, you know, a lot of different hats, you know, a lot of different sides. So if anyone has like professional, technical questions, or more like creative-oriented questions, or you know, specific personal stuff, whatever. So I guess I'll just give you a little rundown. What's going on? I'm here from North Little Rock. I was pretty much born and raised here. Let's see. I've lived in southern Indiana for the last 7 years or so. Let me get this thing chopping. All right. So, it basically. Oh wait, can we turn down like either those lights or those lights? Make it a little easier to see. Also, can everybody hear vaguely okay? No. Turn it up a little bit. All right. Maybe I'll just move this up to the next thing. Give that a shot. Is that vaguely better? All right. Okay. Anyway, you know, I was born here. The first 10 years of my life, I grew up in a military family, so I moved around a little bit. As a toddler, I guess that's when I got into comics. I guess this is when I lived on a nuclear missile base in Montana in the early 80s. So underneath this, you know, idyllic snowscape, there were 229 intercontinental ballistic nuclear missiles. Just, you know, good to bear in mind. Go Cold War. So, like most children in the late 70s, early 80s, really it was Spider-Man's appearance on the Electric Company and, you know, like the TV shows Wonder Woman and the Hulk that were what got me into got me into comics and into fantasy. And I guess from the time I was about 3, as soon as I started like reading books and picking them up, I was also drawing. And, I was able to sort of, bust out things that 3 and 4-year-olds normally bust out. So there's my awesome 1982 depiction of Wonder Woman. Things took like a sinister but slightly more sophisticated twist as Return of the Jedi came along. So, poor Boba. So basically, at this point, I was mostly just like reading. I started getting into like G.I. Joe and Transformers comics, and while I was getting into that, my grandmother started painting in the early 80s. I guess in 1980, she was diagnosed with cancer. She was given a year to live, I believe, but she lived another 24 years. Her cancer returned several times, and she just kind of kept kicking it. But after the first, or during the first wave of treatment, or in the recovery, she was basically just looking for something to do. And I guess that's where Bob Ross steps in. So she never considered herself an artist or anything, but got some oil paint, and lo and behold, she was just quite skilled at it. So every time I would go to visit her, starting when I was about 5, we would sit down, and there would be some Bob Ross watching, and then she and I did a couple of collaborations together, where I would like stegosauruses and gigantic snakes would wind up appearing in her otherwise very peaceful landscape paintings and stuff. But this is my favorite painting of hers, and it's something that before I had really a vocabulary for what I liked about it. From the time I was 5 years old or whatever, there was something about it that always really struck me. Basically, I mentioned it to her a couple of times that I liked it, and then basically when she passed away, I realized that on the back was written in pencil that it was for me to have, and that was really awesome. And so I spent a lot of time staring at this painting because it's kind of right by my front door, and I just think it's really interesting that as my work and style have moved along, a lot of the use of light, a lot of the framing devices, and even the specific angles used in this painting in particular have been extremely influential, but it's something I didn't really pick up on until I had the actual painting. I was like looking at it every morning while eating breakfast. I'm like, oh, this is like the most important single piece of art in my life, probably. So while that was going on, I was reading G.I. Joe comics and Transformers comics and all that. Not the best comics in the world, but they're definitely very immersive, and there were a couple of issues in particular. For any early 80s comic nerd, there were a couple of these wordless G.I. Joe issues that were just head and shoulders better than the rest of the issues. And I remember this issue in particular, just this silent adventure where like Snake Eyes is busting into some castle and it's fighting Storm Shadow. It's just some normal stuff. But again, before I had the vocabulary for it, this was the first issue where I was looking at a comic and I recognized that there was something about storytelling that was different than just the act of like reading a comic or watching a cartoon or being involved in the adventure. And a lot of that was the removal of the words and the sound effects altogether. So this issue had the first time I had ever really paid attention to things like repetition and moment-to-moment transitions, and being able to convey motion and force without using sound effects. So I guess this issue was the first time I ever thought about comics as being something other than the stories that they were telling. And so, this is kind of give you an idea of what you're dealing with right now. So this is me in the mid-'80s. And around 1987, 86, this is when I lived in Montgomery, Alabama, and I was headed to a bookstore to get my weekly comics or whatever. And to my regret, the comics that I normally read didn't have anything new that week. I was like, oh, bummer. And whenever there wasn't like a G.I. Joe comic in, I would kind of accept the busted alternative, which was Sergeant Rock, who was like a sort of outdated World War II Korean War hero. But I knew it was the methadone to G.I. Joe's heroin. And I was like, Sergeant Rock, all right. But then one day I went in, and the lady who ran the store, she was like, oh, I'm really sorry, we don't have any G.I. Joe comics. She's like, but there is a new comic that just came out this week. It's called The Nom. And it's like G.I. Joe kind of, but it's real. And so I was like, okay. So I started collecting The Nom, which is actually written by the same guy who wrote G.I. Joe, but I guess this dude was a veteran himself. But this comic was a real eye-opener for me because it utilized time in a very different way. Basically, it started in 1966, and it was a document of enlisted infantry units tour of duty in Vietnam. So each issue, which came out every month, was supposed to cover a month in a particular squad or platoon's tour of duty. And at the end of 12 issues, they went home if they were not, maimed, crippled, killed, or taken POW by that point, and then a new crew of infantry would come in. The subject matter, relatively speaking, was extremely realistic, mostly because it depicted the sheer boredom. I'm totally ripping off someone's quote right here, but I can't remember who it is. Just oceans of sheer boredom punctuated by these brief moments of utter terror, that occupies most of the space of war. Growing up in the 1980s in basically, like a neocon, late Cold War, Reagan culture, with this sort of glorified fantasy surrounding violence and state violence, The Nom was a really impactful comic for me because there was a lot of violence in the comic, and all of it was fairly horrifying, without necessarily being graphic, but also a lot of the downtime of these 18-year-olds who found themselves in Southeast Asia was illuminated. And on a technical level, this series was drawn by this guy named Michael Golden, who wound up influencing the guy who later became my all-time favorite mainstream comic artist. But a lot of the, I guess this was the first comic where I recognized good comic art. Without knowing who this dude was or anything, I remember reading it and being like, there's something about this art. I don't know what it is, but it's way better than any other comic art I've ever seen. And it also involved a lot of, at the time, a lot more sophisticated transitions and use of time and space on the page than I had been accustomed to with my other comics. So it definitely left a deep impression on me. And in the late 80s, I moved back to Arkansas. And at the time I was growing out of stuff like G.I. Joe and Transformers. But at the time we really had one comic book store here, which was in Levy. And since then it's moved to JFK. But the closest thing I could find to anything outside of the mainstream was like the original black and white run of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and occasionally like Heavy Metal magazine or any of the artists who might have come out of heavy metal. And I had never seen anything that was so gritty and dense and completely unlike any comic I had ever seen. Also, this is a totally outdated style of rendering a comic because of the rise of computer technology in the 90s. But most of this series was done with this really weird paper called duotone paper, which you kind of use it like painting with water when you're a kid. Basically, you draw your line art with normal black India ink, but there are these invisible lines that are buried inside the paper. You use a special chemical, which I'm sure is some sort of highly toxic thing that remains a mystery to all of us. But you put the chemical on the paper with your brush, and as you're painting, if you put one chemical on, this sort of lighter gray comes out. That's a series of parallel lines that are really fine. And then if you use the other chemical, the darker series comes out, which are the crosshatch lines going the opposite way. So I used to, once I started reading these sort of mainstream alternative comics, I was trying really hard to track down this paper, which of course is not the easiest thing to do in North Little Rock in 1988. So I guess around this time, the great adolescent transition happened where I got into role-playing games and heavy metal. And both of these were extremely influential in the way that I was interested in narratives and interested in telling stories. So two of my best friends, Mike Lyerly, Nate Wilson, both North Little Rock natives, were already, they're already kind of working on comics, and while I was getting really into like Final Fantasy as a video game and as an immersive narrative, a lot of the artwork that came with the packaging for a lot of these role-playing games were done by the creator of the game itself. Like Yoshitaka Amano is the guy behind the Final Fantasy series. And I remember like playing these 8-bit video games, which were totally awesome in their own way, but there was always this thing where the instruction booklet had this mind-blowing artwork, and once I was able to piece together that it was the guy who designed the game that did all these illustrations, it seemed like he cared way more about the illustrations than the game. And I started to get the sense that there was something much, much deeper resonating for him underneath, like the package that I would play on the Nintendo. And so it brought this sort of allure to the fantasy narrative for me. And at the same time, that's kind of when I discovered, Master of Puppets by Metallica, which opened up a whole different world and sort of pushed forth that sort of like adolescent push between like the one-dimensional push and pull between good and evil, and the world weighing down on you and how you can push back against the world or whatever. So a lot of the album art for heavy metal records and stuff certainly started to leave its mark. And at the time, that's when I sort of stepped into the narratives that like the X-Men brought forth. So Mike Lyerly, Nate Wilson basically brought metal and brought the X-Men to me in a way that was very mind-opening. We started working on comics together. So the X-Men, I'll still give them props to this day. I don't really read their comics anymore or anything, but I definitely credit the X-Men for giving me a social conscience whatsoever. Especially during the Chris Claremont written run in the late 70s, throughout the 80s, into the very early 90s, as far as issues, especially like issues of social oppression, inequality, not just xenophobia and racism, but more subtle issues, especially in the 80s and especially in Arkansas. Like things like homophobia and nationalism were sort of, packaged within these narratives about, mutant teenagers or mutant young adults who go to like a secret school, and it's the usual, superhero adventures. But there are definitely these certain narratives where I realized that there was an undercurrent that was much more powerful than the narrative itself. And so, Mike and Nate and I had a series that we were working on from the time that we were 12. And I guess, okay, well here's Mike Lyerly and I. We had a day off school, and so we decided, I guess I'm probably 13, he's probably 14 there. So we decided that we needed to have an actual work day where we'd go into the office, which was his dad's, like the closet in his dad's office, and from 9 to 5, we just sit down and work on comics and see what we came out with at the end of the day. We tried to be as focused as we possibly could about it, and things worked out well. However, we were 13, and like right here, here's Mike's folder with his pages inside, and there's a copy of this Wolverine one-shot comic there, which was, like at the time comics were printed on newsprint. And so we're like, okay, they're printed on newsprint, so we have to draw them on newsprint so they could get printed on newsprint. And it didn't occur to us that you could actually draw a comic at any size you want and just use like a photocopier and reduce it. So we would use this one issue of this comic, and for every page we started, we would trace around the comic, to get the size. And we would go to Harvest Foods and buy like a $2 pad of, I think it was called Scribble Pad. That was the thinnest, cheapest newsprint you could possibly get. It came in like a 200 sheet pack. And so a couple of years ago, I realized that I sort of went into a crisis mode for a couple of days where I realized that all the pages were lost somewhere in North Little Rock, decaying. So I had to, make a really quick run through my parents' house and his parents' house to find every page I could to scan them as quickly as possible. And yeah, they got really brittle and everything. But and we cranked out, over that year and a half, we cranked out probably 150 pages of stuff, and we had issues and issues written. So this is one of my really early pages from the backup story I did for that series. The problem was that most of the characters were ours, and we used, I think, 2 pre-existing characters from the Marvel Universe, because there's no reason to think about copyright issues when you're 12 or 13 years old. And so we had dozens and dozens of these pages, and I think it was around like Christmas time, '91, Mike's Uncle Ron, I guess he was over visiting, and Mike was like, "Nate, my Uncle Ron has a really good idea. Hold on, let me get him on the phone." And Uncle Ron was like, "What's up, Nate?" He was like, "I was really thinking, you guys draw a lot of comics, but you might want to think about maybe doing some stuff with all of your own characters. That way you can actually do something with it." Because at this time, this is very serious. We really thought that somehow we would go to Marvel Comics in New York City and go to Stan Lee's office, which I'm sure has been empty for like 25 years while he's living on a yacht doing coke or whatever and getting a tan. But we would go to Stan Lee's office and we'd be like, "Hey, Mr. Lee, I got these comics for you." He'd be like, "Wait, boys, these are great. Here's a contract." We just really thought that's the way it was going to go down. So Mike's Uncle Ron was a nice voice of reason. He was like, you can't do anything with these comics. So you need to just tweak things a bit, start over, so that you can actually do something with it. Fortunately, there was this side project that Mike and Nate Wilson had been working on before we started this series, and it was called DOA. So within a couple of minutes, we were like, okay, well, let's just throw all these in the trash. We're going to do DOA. And we were just very serious. We mapped out 50 issues, and we probably drew 400 or 500 pages of comics. And right when we were getting started, I got like a hardcover book about comics for Christmas one year, but in the back there was a 5-page section that was like, the inside scoop on how to draw comics in Marvel. And there were these photos in there, basically, of this one page of Ghost Rider getting done from like the script stage to the final printed page. And this was the first time I had ever seen photos or any documentation of comic books actually being made. So, I enjoyed the rest of the book, but I spent hours and hours just dissecting every little detail that was in these photos. It was the first time I ever saw just how big pages were, and ever heard of something like non-reproducible blue lines, and I didn't know what this ink was or what that is. I didn't know what this blotter paper was for, so basically I just started trying to track down every detail in each of these photos of the production of a page. And I started drawing, up to a professional size, etc. Okay, now this is just a 2-page spread from a backup story in an old X-Men reprint issue. And there's a British artist named John Bolton who's done comics for decades and decades, and most of the time he paints comics now. But these backup stories were very notable in that there was very little action ever in the stories, besides the stylistic difference that you're dealing with a British school of comic book art, which involved a lot fewer traditional American depictions of action, motion, time passing, as well as typically American comic book camera movements. But once again, it was these non-action filled backup stories that were much more intriguing to me than the superhero adventures in the front of the book. Once again, there was really no vocabulary or context to figure out why they were interesting to me. I just knew that the enrichment they gave to the characters, but also the sophistication of the narrative, just blew the rest of the comics out of the water. And at the same time, I got into a lot of Japanese comics. This is a page from Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira. And Katsuhiro Otomo and Masamune Shiro were definitely, they're definitely manga superstars, but so giving them that credit, they were definitely an end to another whole different school of thought as far as comics narrative. Katsuhiro Otomo, especially because his comics were just as detailed and full of like little specks of dirt and crap that you see in the real world, but at the same time, it was a stylistic movement in American comics was that empty space like this just could not happen. There were just a lot of pointless hatching lines and motion lines. This was unheard of in comics I've been reading for the years previous. So to see something that was so grittily depicted, that appeared so detailed, but involved 40 or 50% of this just being blank space, sort of activated these parts of my brain that had never been activated before. So Mike and I definitely spent a lot of time dissecting these pages, trying to figure out what made them dynamic. Also, the way that motion worked without motion lines. Again, the sensations of floating versus falling. There's just a level of sophistication I had never seen thus far. Also, for Akira in particular, the fact that it's a supernatural story and it's a power fantasy, but it's also wrapped up in vaguely realistic social unrest in Japan in the near future. And this is about the time I was also sort of getting into punk culture, and interest in social unrest was something that was starting to cook and boil inside me. So this is the cover of the first comic book that I published with Mike Lyerly and Nate Wilson, called DOA. And we wound up doing 4 issues and a couple of side issues and one-shots that came out over the next year and a half or 2 years. And basically how it worked was, we had our pages, all of that was the way we knew it, but once it came time to figure out how to print it, this is a whole new problem that we had not anticipated yet. And without realizing what we were doing, this is basically where we discovered the usefulness of being able to scan things, where we realized that my dad had kind of a busted copy machine in his office that we could use until it broke, and then we'd run away and pretend like we weren't copying on it. And we spied out an unused copy machine at the church where our families went, and we would try to copy on it, but then we realized why it was unused. And then we would just try to sneak out of the room very quickly, hoping that we didn't break that also. And for the first issue, we managed to do 100 copies, I guess in September of '92. And basically Michael Tierney, who owns Collector's Edition of the comic book store here, he had a history in the late 70s and early 80s of doing his own self-published comics, so he definitely had a little bit of a soft spot there, and fortunately offered us a little bit of space on the shelves to put our comic. We're like, oh, this is great. We were hoping to, sell a couple of copies while we sold the rest out of our backpacks at school. But to our surprise, we were putting out an issue every 2 months, and we were selling 40 copies of each issue within the 2-month period. So shockingly, we were selling out of every issue before the next issue would come out. Unfortunately, we didn't have any funds whatsoever to do second printings of anything. So we just tried to keep the pace up, and that managed to work really well for about a year and a half. Okay, this is a page that I did for issue number 3 of DOA. This is also the first page I did using, oversized paper, using India ink with, a Croquill nib pen, using a brush for the first time, and trying to letter things in something approaching a professional method. Okay, this is a page from a Daredevil miniseries that was written by this guy, Frank Miller, who has since moved into movies and did 300, Sin City. He directed The Spirit. This guy essentially redefined the comic book in the late 70s, and as a side note, he invented the modern concept of the ninja in the early 80s. So he gets that credit in Western culture. He invented what we know as the ninja. But this is drawn by a guy named John Romita Jr., And both of them have their own contributions to comics that are quite considerable. Frank Miller's just writing this, but he also wrote and drew Batman: The Dark Knight Returns. This is 93, maybe 94 or something, but he started using what seemed to me at the time extremely innovative compositional techniques. And this is kind of the first time where I saw the page as one piece of art. While each panel remained its own piece, there was something about the composition of the page that demanded extra attention. And this is also the first time I ever saw negative space used positively on the space of the page. So I kind of stopped what I was doing at that point and was just doing, I'd start a new idea for a comic and it would only last about 2 pages and I'd get interested in something else, but I'd still be cranking out a page every day. And a lot of this was because I was getting this new information about the semiotics of comics narratives. So I just didn't really, at the time, I didn't have the patience to funnel that into a story itself because I was sort of redefining what I thought was actually cool about comics in the first place. So yeah, during the time while all this is happening, this is when I got into punk rock and everything, which since the mid-'80s has been extremely strong in Little Rock and in Central Arkansas. We had a really nice punk radio show that came on KBF on Friday nights. So you go out skateboarding, you stay up really late to listen to it starting at 1 a.m. or 2 a.m. or whatever. And you just hear about all these different, all these punk bands that were playing all over the world. But then you'd also find out about these, that those same bands were playing under a bridge on the Arkansas River the next week. And that, people that basically are just like plugging into a light socket under a bridge with a bunch of people from the Netherlands or California or whatever. So, this was fascinating. And as we started our own bands and as we started going to a lot of shows, there was a totally different but parallel culture of zine making happening in punk. Zines are basically photocopied fanzines that I think started like in sci-fi circles or whatever. And in the punk world, there was definitely, there were like photography zines, there were poetry zines, there were political zines, there were music zines, of course. And I definitely got really into those. They were cheap. And I was making comics at the time. I also got really interested in making zines at the time. But it didn't occur to me that these were basically the same thing and that content didn't need to be that polarized. So I started making, I was sort of doing double time, making 2 different publications that didn't necessarily need to be 2. And as I became less interested in superheroes, but was still very, my interest in narrative was changing, finally the 2 began to merge. I did a very short-lived rodent, punk teenage rodent adventure series in the mid-'90s. It was really nice to kind of break out of my usual mode of drawing. I finally started using more black space. I sized down the pages a little more so that I could draw more quickly, but also with more immediacy. It was something that to me was fun in a very different way than drawing superhero comics was to me. Around the same time, I finally became aware of Cerebus the Aardvark. It was drawn by a guy named Dave Sim with a guy named Gerhardt who does all the super detailed Baroque background illustration. And I think one's French Canadian. But he's a super successful independent comic artist, and it's another one of the bigger independent titles that I became aware of. But the sophistication of repetition, was a lot more extreme with what Dave Sim was doing. And there would be entire issues that were wordless that would involve, this extremely surly, drunken, reactionary aardvark warrior priest living in medieval times, traveling through a castle, living through some kind of heartbreak or political scandal. And the fact that he could fill up 50 pages with his travels through this castle just sort of blew my mind. So as I was working on Billy Crash in particular, I finally started to experiment with the static camera and with sort of taking the dynamism out of your transitions from panel to panel, which allows you to focus on details within a panel. So that was definitely very eye-opening for me. This is a cover of one of my issues of mid-90s zine called The Schwa Sound, which definitely there were contributors who were my friends, etc. And there were a lot of rantings and writings and really bad poetry, but also I'd fit shorter comics within those. And around 96, I finally put out a self-contained comic with a writer named Emil Heipel, also from Little Rock, called The Playground Messiah, about basically a bunch of high school revolutionaries attempting to make a massive gestural change in society during one day at school, and that day at school goes horribly wrong. And in the mid-90s, during this, this phase of self-publishing, there were a variety of awesome photocopying scams that could be done at, particular photocopy chains. And these scams are not available anymore because of the advent of putting microchips and everything. But I credit a lot of the privilege of just having a bunch of copies of my comics available. I credit that to these awesome victimless scams. So for the first run of The Playground Messiah, we made about 150 copies and got rid of them very quickly. And then about a year later, made a jump to offset print 1,000 copies. So this was more or less the first comic that actually got distributed in any way. And comic book retailers and comic book distributors had no access to it. This was pretty much strictly within the punk rock circle and the zine circle. There's a page from it. The writing part was originally done just as a, I'd say, 5.5, 6-page prose piece. It was just a short story. And it was my first collaboration with somebody who wrote but did not draw. So it didn't occur to me that I didn't have to include every single word from the short story within the comic. So there's definitely a lot of parallel, the story and the art throughout the comic are completely parallel. It didn't occur to me to use the short story as direction, or to, I guess to show, not tell. So a lot of the text wound up just being cut out of a printout and glued on top of the art. But, it took the experience of making that to learn that one has license to use writing as direction as opposed to just using it as the straight narrative. And this is a comic by a friend of mine named Al Burian, who lives between Chicago and Germany. But he was also making comics and zines at the same time in the mid-90s. He's a few years older than me. But this is a comic of his called The Long Walk Nowhere. And it came out right when I moved away from here and moved to the East Coast to go to art school. And all this comic is basically brief scenes of hating life as a teenager and then being a mid-20-something or late 20-something walking through the deserted streets of your hometown while everything's sort of shut down and things seem exactly the same, and looking for some kind of answers, not being able to find it, and going home at the end of the night to make coffee to stay up, presumably for a whole extra day. And that's pretty much it. And here's one of the pages from The Long Walk Nowhere.
Gremlins.
So basically, this is an extremely influential comic for me because this was the first time I saw someone who was approachable, who was in any way my peer. We were pen pals at the time, but I still had never met this dude. It was the first time I'd seen a comic just about regular life, where you have the same power struggles that I had seen in power fantasies, like in superhero comics or whatever, but this sort of ripped the veneer of comics narrative as I knew it away, where I realized, if you have these powerful things to say, and if you understand life from a particular perspective, there's no reason necessarily to try to package it within some other form. It's okay to tell stories about your life, or about an experience of life that approximates what you know. And at the same time, when I was in class one day, a classmate of mine, this guy named Carlo, at the end of class, he was like, "Nate, you need to borrow this comic. It's called I Never Liked You by this guy named Chester Brown. You need to read this." I was like, "Okay, all right." He's like, "No, you need to go home and read this." I was like, "All right." So I went home and I was like, "Well, I guess I'll just read this book." And so I sat down to open it up, and then like 2.5 hours later, I was done with the whole graphic novel, and I was just a mess. And I'd say this isn't the best comic I've ever read. It's up there, but this is probably my favorite comic that I've ever read. This is basically just an autobiographical tale of growing up in the 70s in Ontario and being socially awkward and not understanding human interactions and not understanding why people do the things they do, or more importantly, that there's no reason why people do a lot of the things they do, and that's okay. So the subject matter was incredible, but also I had never seen pages like this. This is a 2-page spread, and to see like a 10-page section that involves like a slumber party or like a teenage game or something, but to see a splash page, that's just one panel, but instead of filling up the entire page, to have it just be an ocean of blackness with a very small page in the middle, this completely blew my mind. And a couple months later, I realized that Chester Brown actually drew every panel individually on a separate sheet of paper, then cut them out and taped them onto a larger piece of paper. And while doing so, he would sort of shuffle them around to determine the composition and flow. So this is the first time where I realized that composition was an active experience, that it was something that could change in the process of producing a page. And also, the fact that he didn't have a master page. He had these master panels, but when I think of all this tape and all these like cut out panels, it just made the finished page look like a piece of garbage. And then I realized that your finished page doesn't necessarily matter, especially if you're printing in black and white. What matters is what shows up as the book is printed. This was extremely liberating and allowed me to start messing around with cutting and pasting and taking panels and photocopying them and manipulating them with like contrast and darkness and making them distorted, and then using that as the printable page. In subsequent printings of this book, I think for price reasons or whatever, for cost reasons, they no longer have the beautiful black backgrounds, which is really unfortunate because it's a totally different book when you're not just inside this sea of blackness with this narrative. So a few months later, I started on this small graphic novel called Conditions, which takes place in a fictionalized version of North Little Rock. And there are a lot of recognizable spots in it. The main characters were basically physically based on 2 of my best friends, but not necessarily in personality or anything. And I guess this is the first time I realized that it was okay to take from the people or to take from the places and you weren't necessarily using or exploiting them. It just sort of drew a closer connection for you as an artist while depicting the characters, but it definitely caused some confusion. I remember sending it to, this is Eli and Marilee, 2 of my best friends. When I sent it to them when I was done, they were definitely confused for a couple of days. And when I spoke to Marilee on the phone afterwards, she's like, "Oh, I got Conditions in the mail." Like, it was weird, it took a while, because I know it's supposed to be me, but it's not me. So, as years have gone by, there have certainly been situations like that, which I've, of course, had to re-examine parts of my own creative process that might be encroaching or exploitative as well. But right after this book was done was when Sufi Nun Squad went on our first really long tour. We started touring in '97, and this came out in '99. So this tour and this book was the first time I was able to actually get rid of a couple of 100 copies of a book in a month, all over the country. And it was still just at shows, or I would go to a store that sold zines, mostly, and try to get rid of them there. And I was doing illustrations for a punk zine at the time, but right around 1999 was when people started writing, asking about contributing to other things. I started getting feedback from people who I had never met about the comics I made. And also starting with this book, I was trying to figure out exactly how to become a part of comics as an industry and as a culture. But since I really didn't read comics, like I occasionally would read these comics and graphic novels that I would be given or that I would hear about, but I hadn't read comics really in 4 years or so. So I decided the easiest way, especially coming from within this sort of super do-it-yourself punk culture, where the whole point, the whole thing that makes punk bands not rock bands is that, in theory, there's no difference between the audience and the performer. That you'll put up a band at your house that's coming from a different part of the country or the world, you'll cook them dinner, you'll set up a show for them, you'll collect gas money, they'll sleep on your floor, and then the next month you'll do that in their basement, their house. So I simply tried to apply that DIY ethic to the gargantuan comic book industry. So I decided I'd write a list of about 20 of my favorite publishers, editors, comic book artists, writers, and every time I finished a book, I would send a copy to every single person on the list. And most people didn't write back, which I expected. Some people did, and 2 of the people who did write back are my current publishers, Top Shelf Productions. And basically this started about a 5-year dialogue that we did where they would take the time to actually give an honest critique of what I was doing, and they took a real interest in where I was coming from as a creator, and I really appreciated that. It was also nice having a DIY chip on my shoulder to find somebody in the comics publishing industry who seemed to be guided by the same ethical framework. This is an interior page from Conditions. The top row of panels are all photocopied clones of probably this panel. And then after I would paste on the photocopy, I'd go back in with a whiteout pen and draw the white space in for the additions, and then I would ink over the whiteout. And also, a lot of these extra panels are a lot more influenced by Japanese comics, where you're just moving from aspect to aspect of a scene, or moving from detail to detail, where time is able to slow down and speed up within the course of a couple of panels to divert and redirect attention. This is another page. This is the last page of Conditions. And I didn't really care what I was doing with the writing, and the story did kind of just end. It worked. But this was the beginning of my personal interest in unresolved endings in comics, or in ambiguous endings. I've always been a fan of books and movies that seem to open up at the end, so that you get the sense that you're only stepping into a much larger narrative that continues without you as a reader or a viewer. And that's always, all my favorite stuff generally falls into that category. After that, this is another comic / zine I did called Wonderful Broken Thing. This was sort of the perfect meeting point between comic and zine. But because of the format, most of the comics were 1 or 2 page segments. And particularly with the types of focus and transition that I've been talking about, I increasingly became interested in the micro narratives that occur within moments. So this is just a one-page comic I did that uses a lot of the same photo manipulation. This entire panel is just a small detail of this panel blown up on the photocopier. I was also interested in cleaning up my line and being able to depict different degrees of gray using different kinds of patterns. So this issue as a whole was successful. I really wanted to take it to a new step, and I felt I had gone as far as I could go by photocopying and incessantly scanning copies. Because by the time this book came out, I made 1,400 copies total of Conditions, and I was making over 1,000 copies of every comic or zine I was doing at the time. They were selling really well, but a whole lot of time went into the stapling, the collating, the printing, the sneaking out of copy stores, etc. Fortunately, in early 2000, I was walking to class in New York, and then right downstairs and around the corner from where I lived, there was a bookstore. It was a Shakespeare and Company bookstore. And one time, I just happened to look over, and I saw a little flyer about this big, and it was for students in my school whose final project was some kind of book, of any kind, and it was a $2,500 self-publishing grant. It's the only flyer I ever saw for this, and I kind of feel like I'm the only person who applied for it, but I did get it. And so basically I just sort of extended the formal and structural ideas from Wonderful Broken Thing and started a series called Walkie Talkie in 2000. The first issue was kind of a zine comic hybrid, and I had exactly enough money from the grant to make it a huge 68-page book and only charged $250 for it, I think. I was able to take it on tour all summer, and I sold a bunch of copies, and that was working. But this book was my first step into the world of getting books distributed through Diamond Comics. Diamond Comics is the comic book distributor in North America. So I've been running a record label for several years. I've been distributing stuff in the punk world, but I sort of had to learn a whole new kind of hoops to jump through. And it took about 5 or 6 months of deliberation. I guess they had to have a special meeting about this book to see if they were going to carry it, because it wasn't exactly a comic, but it wasn't a zine, and then finally they decided to take it. They managed to carry all 4 issues, but because this is a distribution giant, any comic is not profitable for the distributor unless it's sold more than 2,500 copies. And the entire print run of this was 2,000 copies. But there were a couple loopholes. One was that you'd usually get until your 3rd issue before you got dropped. Another loophole was that if you made every comic a one-shot, you could never get canceled. Because if there's no 2nd issue, they're like, sorry. You're like, oh, well, I have another issue number 1. Like, oh, okay, we'll take it. So I was starting to learn a couple of these tricks. Fortunately, my sales guy really liked the comic, and so they were going to cancel it after the 2nd issue. But he's like, no, I like it. Just send number 3. And usually they'd only sell about between 500 and 700 copies. But because of that, because of the kindness of that sales guy, finally my book started to be available in random comic book stores throughout the country. This is the 2nd issue, which remains my all-time favorite single comic I've done. For the most part, I just did this, at kind of a busted time in life, and I was just I locked myself in my room for a couple of months and did this book. It's when I sort of jumped wholeheartedly into a more dreamy, intuitive narrative. But I will admit I didn't realize at the time just how intuitive it was. It made sense to me because I didn't have the patience or the foresight to realize that, it wasn't a clear narrative because I'd never done a story longer than 32 pages. So, the whole book was about 48 pages or 52 pages. But if I were to do it now, it would easily be about a 150-page narrative, and it would be clear, it would be sound. So this is one of those things where I developed a style over the next couple of years that embraced a more intuitive, dreamlike narrative. And as I got more into sort of pop crossover Japanese novelists, I guess the most recognizable would be Haruki Murakami, something really spoke to me in that each of these novelists were, in a much more successful way, doing what I thought I was doing with these intuitive narratives. This is the cover of the 3rd issue, and the 3rd and 4th were a continuing narrative. The total was, about 60 pages or so. It was sort of the same thing where I thought I was really stretching out to do the 60-page story, and as soon as I was done, I realized that if it was just a 200-page story, it would have worked a lot better. There's a page from it. I was trying to clean up things even more and remove a lot of the hatching and a lot of the excess rendering that I was increasingly becoming aware was not essential to the conveying of information within the page. there's the fourth issue, the final issue. And at this time, right after that fourth issue came out, I moved back to the East Coast to Providence, Rhode Island, to start an abysmal year and a half of hating life. When I got there, however, I finally read this graphic novel called Perfect Example by a guy named John Porcellino. And he's been self-publishing since 1986, and he's essentially invented an entire school of comics. He does autobiographical comics, but he's also a Zen Buddhist influenced narrator. And I mean that not just in terms of subject matter, but I mean in his depiction, of the world. He spends a lot of time, apparently. I mean, these look like very quickly done books, but I guess he spends a lot of time determining what the essential elements of each image are to depict what's happening while leaving out any unessential elements. And basically it's just the story of a kid in the mid-'80s, at the end of his teenage years, who's horribly depressed, who is looking for a reason to want to be alive. And there are these very understated moments that are very candid as far as, catching a glimpse past the curtain of reality and, finding the place in yourself that actually desires living, in time and space. So as part of, I guess, his Zen approach to books, he tries to have extremely unornamental language that is often parallel when it's voiced over, but he tries very hard not to be poetic in his writing, and when it's at its best, it's extremely sublime, but also stylistic elements like, his character's getting his hair cut here, and you can start to see little chunks that you assume are, their hair falling on his shoulders. That's what they are. But then as the hair is being cut, you see it on his feet here, or on the ground, and obviously these are the same strokes, and they are the hair, but just these subtle additions are something much, much more than just the hair. And they're very different than the expressionist elements that I was used to in comics that weren't representational or realistic depictions of reality. Sorry about the redundancy there. This is a page from what I think is the best graphic novel of all time, called Hicksville, by a guy named Dylan Horrocks, who's from New Zealand. And Drawn and Quarterly just reissued this finally after 10 years. And this is about, this is like a layer upon layer book about a journalist who hears about a mysterious town in the Pacific Islands where all the people on the island have a bizarre culture that revolves around comics. So he goes there to interview this long-lost comic book superstar who just lives on the island, but then gets sucked into the personal lives of the people there. And then, because their culture revolves around comics, he sort of researches the stories that they have to tell about this dude by going to their zine library or their comic library, and each of them has written their own comics to document these real-life events. So within this detective story and within this personal drama, it's punctuated by these complete comics that are, that are inset within the graphic novel, that are drawn and written in completely different styles. Some of them on notebook paper, and some of them as superhero narratives, and some of them are just cut and paste zines that are different perspectives from each of the people within the town. And this was kind of what I'd been waiting for as far as the next step beyond merging what I knew about zine narratives and comic narratives, but looking to bring it back 100% into the realm of comics as a form. And at the same time, I guess, I got into Charlie Kaufman, the filmmaker who did Adaptation, Cynic Gauche, New York, Being John Malkovich, and I feel like Hicksville could very easily be a Charlie Kaufman narrative. So once all my self-published comics were long out of print, and I was really just looking for a way to save up money to publish them myself in a collected book, I had a friend who worked at a publisher called Soft Skull Press in New York, and we ran into each other by chance, and he was like, oh, I was actually looking for you because we're looking to reprint, we'd like to put out a book by you. And I just started a new book in my head, but they put out a collected edition of all the self-published books I had done starting in the late 90s called Tiny Giants. This is me hating life in Providence, working on my next book. This is, I guess, early 2003. And then my next book with Soft Skull was a small graphic novel called It Disappears, which was a smaller format. It involved sort of a different composition that would revolve around the 2-panel page as opposed to a free form, or even, like a lot of comics will feature a 6-panel grid where it's, 3 rows of 2, or a 9-panel grid that's 3 by 3. So I tried to really free things up and just have a 2-panel page throughout the book for the most part. It was a highly personal book, but largely sort of trying to incorporate political perspective into a more broad and universal personal narrative. Those 2 books went out of print, and my business with Soft Skull Press was not the best. They basically just put out too many books in order to pay their rent in New York City, and so there were a couple of books that sold hundreds of thousands of copies that they had to spend most of their time on, and then every other book sort of fell by the wayside. And that previous book, It Disappears, they only printed 2,000 copies, but at the time I had been self-publishing about 3,000 copies of every book. So I was able to break up with them in a very adolescent email to Soft Skull Press. I would say that it's not you, it's me, but it's actually you, sorry. And my friends, Microcosm Publishing, who had just moved to Bloomington where I lived, offered to put out everything with some unpublished stuff as an omnibus edition called Sounds of Your Name. And I guess there were 2 more major creators who were peers of mine who offered a very big influence in my life. This is a page by a guy named Dash Shaw. He's a few years younger than me, went to the same school, but not at the same time. And this is from his first graphic novel called Love Eats Brains. And he's best known for his last 2 books. One's called Body World, that Pantheon put out last year. And they put out a very highly acclaimed book called Bottomless Belly Button. That's sort of a correction-style family drama of reckoning that's somewhat supernatural. But he essentially was just living on his own planet. And the boldness of doing things like saying heat, heat, heat around a radiating sun and forcing you to get into the sensory experience of sitting and feeling your skin on a tree branch just by writing touch and pointing to where your skin is touching the branch. This just kind of stopped me in my tracks. And it's not, it didn't make me actually go in this direction, but the fact that he was essentially taking the steps that John Porcellino took as far as removing the excess and trying to get to what fundamentally makes comics communication what it is. I feel like Dash, at a very young age, was doing things that no one in comics has ever done before. So he's, in our lifetime, or in my generation, he's definitely a person to watch. He's already had a vast influence in the last 3 or 4 years on comics. And this is a 2-page spread by my best friend Aaron Toby. We've been friends for about 10 years and have been collaborators throughout that time. Her primary influence is a woman named Linda Berry, who's a novelist and a comic book artist. Linda's comics are also extremely forthright, mostly tales about growing up in a really wacky, raucous, multicultural family. And her lettering style and everything left a huge mark on Aaron's comics. In general, the way that Aaron's comics have made a mark on me was her focus on plainness, on being able to spend time pinpointing states like doubt and desire, and trying to take away the feelings of shame or second guessing that might come about when expressing those things. This is actually a comic adaptation of a Laurie Anderson performance piece that we saw. So I guess it's 2 or 3 levels of collaboration there. but she remains my production assistant, and we work together doing the last couple of books as far as she handles a lot of Photoshop wizardry, etc. So then once moving to Indiana, I did, especially after what I was just saying about being plain, being forthright, exploring concrete personal issues, I did a one-shot comic called Please Release that was about working with people with developmental disabilities. It was about moving around too much in your 20s. It was about the mobility and privilege of punk culture and how these things sort of intertwine. And because my comics had gotten so dreamy and intuitive and so tripped out, I had tried to focus on making this strictly autobiographical and extremely concrete. And it worked in general very well. But also because there were these, that was a pretty conservative framework to put this comic within. A lot of the visual narrative elements started to emerge that I hadn't considered yet, such as using captions and voiceovers as means to physically divide a panel or a page. I guess in taking this panel and making it one panel, but using the captions to divide it into 4 panels to show weather changing. Really, I was doing this for myself, and at this point, I had actually given up entirely on the prospect of being able to draw comics full time. I was still submitting stuff to publishers, but I really wasn't doing any of these comics with an audience in mind. So I self-published a run of these, and then finally Top Shelf Productions decided to put out the official version of it, to my great surprise. There's a page from it, just a moment in extension between 2 people. I did a couple of illustrations for a Canadian novel called Joyland by Emily Schultz, basically about a bunch of, a very dark tale of a bunch of adolescents living in Canada and Michigan during the great video game crash of 1983. And most of it has to do with teenage hijinks and death, but it's framed within basically these arcade adventures as the video game industry was shutting down completely for a couple of years. After that, I spent a couple of years working on this book called Swallow Me Whole, which is about a couple of teenage step-siblings growing up in what is basically a fictionalized version of Little Rock, North Little Rock. And they have a terminally ill grandma who moves into the house with them. Each of the step-siblings starts to show symptoms of different mental disorders, but it's not, and it was never intended to really be a book about mental illness. It's mostly about the kids' families, their cultural frameworks, what it's like living in their town, and really what the experience is like of just being a teenager, that it's hard enough, that you're confused enough, but how their relationship to each other changes as they move in different directions, but as they appear to be the only 2 who really have some kind of insight into what they're experiencing with their mental disorders. And the book's done pretty well. It won some awards and stuff. This was also during the time where I had no expectations necessarily of the book being published. So it wound up getting a lot of praise for its innovative use of lettering. And while actually moving through these pages, it just occurred to me that in general, lettering in comics is very utilitarian. It's to convey words. And we have a lot of tricks, visually speaking, by which you can make things distorted. You can make images distorted or out of focus in order to to redirect. But as far as conversation is concerned, there was nothing to really activate the reader. So I wound up making a lot of lettering illegible. In general, because one of the characters has issues with obsessive compulsive disorder and schizophrenia, a lot of her experiences had to do with being focused on patterns and finding sensory information really overwhelming. So there are scenes where the character is in the high school cafeteria And when you enter a cafeteria in a school of 1,300 people, it's just this garble of sound. But up until that point, I'd never really seen a comic that could convey it properly. Because even in books where you have a bunch of random word balloons, you can read every word on every balloon. So I just started having further away voices lettered as small as I possibly could. And then it even occurred to me, why should you be able to understand what these people are saying in the back of the cafeteria? So I would kind of start writing words, but kind of just scribble. And I would occasionally I still get letters and emails from people who are kind of mad that I gave them a headache, or they're like, man, I just think your book needs to be printed bigger, because I tried to read it for a long time, but I couldn't, and it's just I couldn't read it, man. It was like I couldn't understand the words. And then I know I did my job. So I spent a lot of time trying to bring out the auditory side of the sensory experience of the characters in the book. This is another page from the book, one of my favorite pages I've done. After that, I spent 2.5 years doing the art to Swallow Me Whole, and I spent several years before that trying to write it into a cohesive story out of the dream from which the book emerged. And I really just need to kind of change my gears. So my partner Rachel Borman and I did a couple of short stories together that are both awkward but true tales from her life growing up. This also was sort of a reintroduction to the world of self-publishing. I didn't try very hard to get this distributed, because usually I go to about 6 to 10 comic book shows a year, and I'm able to sell a bunch of copies just person to person, which is very satisfying. So our first collaboration was a book called Cakewalk, which was about Rachel growing up in an extremely culturally homogenous part of northwestern Indiana, and her making a very ignorant Halloween costume choice, where basically she always admired Aunt Jemima, the trademarked character, and she always looked at Aunt Jemima, the pancake syrup shape, while eating breakfast, and she just she's like, oh, Aunt Jemima's family just must really love her and love how she makes pancakes for them every morning. Everybody in the world must love Aunt Jemima. So she tried to dress up as Aunt Jemima for Halloween. It was a very bad decision, but the core of the book is that every single adult that she runs into throughout the course of the day completely drops the ball as far as letting her know why this is a bad idea, or even worse, encouraging her or thinking it's funny, but not telling her why they think it's funny, and not telling her why it's inappropriate or why it's something she shouldn't do. And so she's just left with these very strong visceral reactions from, oh, I'm sorry, I should mention, the reason why it goes way over the edge is because she grows up in this extremely homogenous, all-white town in Indiana, but she goes in blackface, having never seen blackface in her life. Sorry, this page doesn't necessarily totally depict that. But yeah, basically, she's left with the feeling that is the exact opposite of what the adults are intending, or the adults are basically just generating new seeds of cultural racism within her, and she's just left with this horrifying experience. This is probably my second or third favorite comic I've ever done, and it's always really great as far as getting into conversations with people and stuff. It's also a really good litmus test when I'm meeting new people where we're not coming from the same place. I know a lot of people, I expect a certain degree of nervous laughter and anxiety reading the story, but it's extremely uncomfortable. I mean, it's essentially a horror story. But every once in a while, people are like, hey man, I read that comic. Like, that was funny, man. Like Aunt Jemima. I'm like, oh, cool. I'll just cross you off my list. So I have a little short list of people I just kind of cut out of my life because that's their immediate response to Cakewalk.
We're at time.
Oh, thank you. All right, book. Another cover. I did some illustrations for this book about declassified CIA documents filtered through the context of food. Here's a new book I just spent 2 hours working on, or 2 years working on, called The Silence of Our Friends, written by this guy Mark Long. It is It is a fictionalized narrative about him growing up in the late 60s in Houston, Texas, amidst the civil rights movement and relationships between two families, while some legal drama ensues. These are pages. I painted these. That's cool. And this is my new book that will be out in July called Any Empire. Basically, this is sort of a full circle book for my life that is essentially about the privileged first world fantasy surrounding violence, particularly with children of the baby boomer generation who basically grew up in a culture of G.I. Joe and He-Man, but who, with varying relationships to real world violence. It follows three characters, each of whom have a different relationship to violence and to fantasy in their own lives, and following those characters through the world as their perspectives on violence and fantasy change. This is a page from a fiction anthology of which I was the only comic book artist that's a benefit for an educational center in Darfur in the Sudan. And it was nice to be able to go back and do like an actual weirdo comic. It's intended for young adults, so I tried to make it fit a smart teenager's mindset. But the rest of the stories are like by R.L. Stine, Nikki Giovanni, and Joyce Carol Oates. So this will be out in September, and it'll be interesting to see how that works. I just completed a short story that I wrote and drew for DC Comics for a series called Sweet Tooth that a friend of mine does, which is very exciting to see, other people color and letter my stuff. It's been received pretty well. It's also nice to finally do, something for the big dogs and have it not be a horrifying experience. Just extra stuff I've been doing on the side. New book. All right, that should do it. If anybody has any questions about anything, go for it. Yeah.
Have you ever drawn yourself as a character?
Oh yeah. And with varying degrees of masking that, particularly in the just straight autobiographical comics, I don't really try to conceal myself. I definitely do different versions of myself in a lot of my comics. I shy away from it nowadays, except for Any Empire, because I'm just not interested personally in autobiographical narrative. I'm much more interested in fiction, and as far as stories that influence me, I'm much more interested in novels than comics. So yes, to varying degrees, I do. Anybody have any other questions?
It's like a typical work day when you are working.
Well, when I have a full work day, essentially, I get up about 7:30, and between 9 and 9:30, I get cracking. And in general, I'm now able to do just for 5 days a week, which is great. But the last 2 years, I'm doing 6 days a week, 9 hours a day. And I was doing these 2 graphic novels simultaneously, so I would try to do 1 page of one book in the mornings, break for lunch, and I'd try to do 2 pages of another book about the afternoon. And a lot of it just had to do with, as far as discipline and work ethic is concerned, doing that to, in a way so you hate life for about 2.5 weeks, and then at a certain point, you cease hating life, at least that part of it, because you've stopped complaining to yourself. There's a part of you that accepts that that's what you're going to do today and tomorrow and the next day, and then it's just smooth sailing. However, I've had no social life for the last 2 years. So hopefully I can find a better balance pretty soon. Yes?
What happened to your 2 friends you started out with?
Oh, well, Michael Irely, actually just kicked it with him last night. He is a Dutch-influenced representational oil painter. He lives between here and Austin, Texas, and for the last couple of years we lived in the same town in Indiana, and we're still in bands together and stuff, so he's great. Nathan Wilson, his mom, and sister, are hanging right back there. He basically works for Google, writes software, does programming, and he and I are actually co-writing a new graphic novel that hopefully I can get started on in the fall called Cover. So yeah, we're still in very close contact. Okay, sure.
So if anybody else has questions, Nate's going to be moving out to the front. He's going to be out there selling and signing books, and I'm sure he'd be happy to chat things up on a personal basis. So thank you everybody for coming. For my class, just hang out for a few minutes. Yes, thank you.